Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peter Ramsey from WSP, so I'm presenting this afternoon on this Snack and Learn webinar, presenting on developing a framework for livable rural communities. Just starting with a bit of housekeeping. This webinar will be a little bit longer than usual, so about 30-minute presentation and 10 to 15 minutes Q&A at the end. So yes, you can ask a few questions once I finish presentation, but you can put your questions into the chat. And we'll go through those questions at the end. There's a couple of attachments for you to download. There's a set of slides that we'll be going through, and there's also a white paper on rural mobility looking at 30-minute rural communities. So as I say, I'll be talking about 30 minutes, then there'll be time for Q&As at the end. So as I said, my name is Peter Ramsey from WSP. I'm a technical director in the Future Mobility team here in the UK. I've got actually almost exactly 25 years experience in transport planning consultancy for WSP, with the past 4 years in future mobility. So I specialise in future mobility policy and strategy, particularly supporting the public sector, so national, regional and local government. And really over the last few years, we've been doing quite a lot of work in the rural mobility space, culminating particularly in developing the first subnational rural mobility strategy in England, which we'll come on to a little bit more detail in a moment. But we've done over a range of other rural mobility projects, including developing broader frameworks, developing a future mobility strategy with a key component around rural, looking at rural hubs and rural mobility hubs, and more recently, looking at the case for rural investment. So as a team, as a future mobility team, we focus on change, really. So we look at those 6 blue areas in the centre of this diagram. So this is taken from the Department for Transport's Future Mobility Urban Strategy from 2019. So we're particularly interested and focus on automation, clean transport, new business models to deliver those, new modes, data connectivity, and changing attitudes. But to those 6 areas of change identified by Department for Transport, we've also added aggregation, so that's bringing activities together into individual locations. So think about mobility hubs, mobility as a service, and freight consolidation. But also we've added to changing attitudes to changing places as well. And that particularly comes to play when we're thinking about rural places and how those are changing over time. But we're not just interested in the changes themselves and the activities and technologies and the delivery models. We're also focused very much on the need for delivering those changes. So we focus on people, on a people, place and activity-based approach. So how places are changing, how people are changing and their needs, and how the activities they undertake are changing, and aligning those with the broad objective areas of environment, society and economy, and really how mobility supported by energy and digital connectivity support those needs, but also the wider range of resources that we need to deliver mobility, from space to materials to funding to policy and maintenance as well. But when working with our clients, we like to think of wholes, so the whole organisation. So particularly in my area, working with the public sector, not just thinking about people who deliver transport, but all the other activities that the public sector delivers, and how can we, as transport specialists, work with those other sectors to deliver those wider objectives. We also think about the whole area, so not just individual locations, but how they connect with the wider areas they're part of. And again, importantly for rural areas, we think about how they connect to other rural areas, but also how they connect to urban areas as well. And we think about a whole journey. So if we're going to meet net zero targets, if we're going to support other modes and services compete with a private car, then we need to think about the whole door-to-door journey as well. So a very broad summary of what we do in future mobility. So just a couple of projects that I'd like to highlight that we've done, which will go through some of the activities we've taken to deliver these projects. So as I mentioned a moment ago, we worked and delivered the first subnational rural mobility strategy in England. So that southwest rural mobility strategy, you can see on the map, that southwest area of England. That was for 2 of the 7 subnational transport bodies that cover the whole of England, Peninsula Transport, that kind of pink area, and Western Gateway, so that darker red area. So together, we developed a combined Southwest rural mobility strategy. And that was really one of our first deep dives into rural conditions and practice. And importantly, it included a detailed segmentation of rural people and the places across the Southwest. We developed a high-level set of rural scenarios, so what might the future rural look like? We developed a rural mobility vision and framework, and we developed a set of place-based bundles of interventions as well. The other piece of work I'd like to mention, which built on that Southwest mobility strategy, was a piece we've just finished for Cumbria County Council, so up in the northwest of England, that red blob on the map. The area includes the Lake District National Park, so some of you may be aware of that if you're outside of the UK. So we developed an overall framework for rural accessibility, which also looked at monitoring and appraisal of rural resilience and reliability, including specifically the highway network and its reliability and resilience. We looked at the future of rural bus services, and we also looked at the future of alternative fuels in rural areas. Again, key to that work was the segmentation of different types of people and place across Cumbria, but also the development of alternative rural scenarios and what we termed a preferred future setting, a preferred scenario for the future of rural Cumbria. So really, why rural, why now? So not just in the UK, but abroad as well and further afield. Many countries have very city-centric economies, and that tends to lead to rural areas being left behind, forgotten, and disadvantaged. But in the UK, or in England itself, about 17% of the population lives in rural areas, about 10 million people. And that's equivalent to around everyone under the age of 15, or just about everyone over statutory retirement age. So a very significant proportion of people living in areas which are often disregarded by policy and delivery. Rural areas continue to decline in terms of provision of rural services. That's particularly in England has occurred over the last 10 years or so. Our rural areas are continuing to change. If you think about how Brexit is changing our rural areas, for example, so the freedom of the government to set its own agricultural policies means that how agriculture is delivered in rural areas might change in the UK compared to Europe. So there may be more change in rural places over coming years than there were in previous years. There's that people and place focused approach to planning, which we deliver through some of our work, and very much needs to be at the forefront of delivering change and delivering better rural mobility in our countryside and coastal places. That leads to a needs-based level of intervention, so identifying what the needs are and bringing those future mobility and other interventions to support those needs. And yes, there's a whole range of new technologies and tools available to transport planning practitioners and others to support rural mobility, but those need to be focused on the rural needs, not applied blanketly across areas. And there's new approaches to delivery, new business models, new delivery models that could be brought to bear in rural places. So a significant opportunity to deliver and do things differently in rural places. So what are the major social and economic challenges in rural places? Certainly through our work, we've identified a very significant variation in wealth across rural areas. As could be seen in our Southwest work, some places are almost entirely affluent. So if you take some types of rural settlements, they're predominantly, if not entirely, affluent residents. But other areas are almost entirely less affluent, albeit with some pockets of less affluence, even in some of those wealthy locations as well. So significant variations in wealth across rural areas. There's the complex employment web. So not just tourism and agriculture, as many people think is a focus of rural areas. There's a complexity in the employment that supports both those two industries and the wider other industrial sectors that either support them or operate independently within rural areas. There's a complex and difficult housing market in England and the wider UK. In many core tourist locations, traditional families are being moved out due to the increase in house prices. So people come in paying over the odds for holiday accommodation and rental accommodation, so that lower paid people have move out of those areas because they can't afford to live there, but then commute back in to do the jobs that are absolutely necessary in rural areas. There's the brain drain, where younger people leave rural areas to do further education, go to university and college, but then there aren't the jobs for the higher paid, higher skilled jobs in rural areas for them to come back to. There's the demand for space. So if all forecast demand and need for space in the UK was all added up, that'd be more than it would come to more than the available space across the UK, and that puts a particular strain on rural places, and particularly on agricultural land. There's an issue around seasonality population. So in peak tourist seasons, the populations of some settlements increase manyfold, with providing a strain on transport, on wider services and resources. But outside of those tourist seasons, the population drops again. So often leaving services with insufficient usage to support their ongoing delivery. There's issues that more personal and individual around personal resilience and socialisation. Even more affluent people, for example, who lose the ability to drive, can be just as isolated as those who are less affluent. So there's resilience issues within the rural communities, but irrespective of how affluent they are. And then there's issues around administrative boundaries, local authority boundaries, national boundaries. So rural areas tend to span across those boundaries, but the delivery of rural mobility tends to stop, or often stops, at those boundaries. So the needs of people travelling across those boundaries to access work, to access healthcare and education, aren't always supported by the mobility services that they need. So what are the key issues for rural areas, mobility issues for rural areas? So there's the limited and costly public transport. So in England, over the last decade or so, rural bus services have reduced hugely, which is then exacerbated by the lack of active travel infrastructure, which leads to transport deserts, where really there's no choice for many people other than to drive, to have their own cars. That leads to car dependency, clearly, which then, for the less affluent parts of the communities, leads to fuel poverty, where they're paying out a much larger proportion of their incomes to support their ownership and fueling of those cars. There are major issues around digital connectivity. So there are still significant areas of rural populations and segments and settlements which aren't well connected to the digital networks, either over the air or by fixed broadband, which leaves both communities and industries at a disadvantage to their urban counterparts. There's a reliability and resilience issue, but particularly around transport itself. So in many rural areas are much more susceptible to reliability and resilience issues, particularly from adverse weather. In many places in rural areas, the diversion routes, if a road is closed, are much longer than in an urban environment, often leading to substantial increases in journeys. And then there's that seasonality issue, not just around increases or changes in populations, but also in the level of service provision. So how there's an increase in public transport provision, perhaps at times to support the tourist population, but it's withdrawn again at the end of the peak tourist season, with essentially a yo-yoing of services for rural residents, or permanent residents. But as we often say in our presentations around rural mobility, we can't just look at the negatives, the challenges of rural areas. We also need to look at the benefits that our rural areas provide us with. Rural areas will be absolutely central to climate change and resilience, but through providing renewable energy generation, through providing that resilience to, for example, providing areas to reduce the impact of adverse weather and increased rainfall, and reducing flooding impacts, including on urban areas. There's a major issue around environmental net gain and nature recovery. Rural areas surely are very much at the centre of those activities. Clearly, food production and security, rural predominantly the area where all that food is produced. And then more softer issues like the great outdoors and the tourism and leisure offer that our rural areas offer, in addition to what our urban areas provide. There's that land resource I mentioned. So the whole range of different opportunities and benefits in terms of land provision that our rural areas provide, from nature conservation, renewable energy, climate resilience, development land, etc. Rural areas offer much of that provision. Then there's wider economic resources, whether it be building materials or water provision or energy distribution. Then wider economic resources, then for wider rural economy as well. So not just agriculture and tourism, but the broader range of industrial segments that the rural areas support, whether it be manufacturing, distribution, as well as tourism and agriculture. And then there's a broader, again, softer issue around well-being and quality of life, both of rural residents, but also urban residents who move out either for the day or for a week or for a holiday or permanently into rural areas to increase their well-being and improve their quality of life. So we need to talk about the benefits as well as the challenges that rural areas have. Just moving on to the work that we've been doing, particularly on those two projects I mentioned earlier. And one of the first things we've done is do a very deep dive into rural places. So this map shows the Office of National Statistics here in the UK, their map of urban rural classification. So those kind of orangey brown areas of the urban, everything else is rural. So the red, the purple, the blue, and the green and cream colour. So the green and cream colour show the sparse or remote areas in the UK, many of which are along the coast as well. So compared to many areas across the world, they may not be as remote as many areas, but certainly within the UK, they count as remote. And for those of you who know the southwest of England or Cumbria, you can see that many of those areas are indeed both remote and along the coast. So in terms of doing that segmentation, we looked at a whole range of different characteristics of rural places. So we looked at settlement size from rural towns all the way down to individual dwellings and everything in between. We looked at that remoteness piece. We looked at the potential impact of topography from upland areas to the floodplains, whether places were coastal, estuarial, so on the rivers as they emerge into the sea, and whether they're inland, but also looked at the impact of islands on connectivity. The issue of protections also came up, so whether they're national parks or other environmental designations, what are the land use planning designations that control the level of development in rural areas. In terms of transport, there's the connectivity, and how that varies across different rural areas, particularly between areas that are remote and those that are much closer to urban areas. We looked at that rural affluence piece and how different settlements have different levels of affluence and wealth. And then the broader economy, so the different types of activity that dominate in different rural places. So in the southwest, we identified at least 40 different types of rural place, and identified nearly 1,000 different rural places, both within settlements and outside of settlements. So did very much a deep dive to identify different types of rural place and their different needs and challenges. We then combined that with understanding the needs and characteristics of rural people. So we developed a set of personas, looking at typical residents, looking at people who visit rural areas, particularly tourists, and also the organisations, all those people and organisations who experience rural mobility. So the residents personas focused on data from Experian Mosaic, so the consumer classification data, particularly the rural segments that they have. We developed a set of tourist personas, recognising the different types of people who visit rural areas for different types of activity. And we looked at a broad range of both business and public sector services in terms of those organisation identities and personas as well. And what this does really is to enable rural mobility to be viewed through the lenses of the different types of people and the challenges they face, the different circumstances and the reasons they travel. And this work is validated by focus groups and interviews with both organisations and people who represent those different personas. But the next piece of work that we'd like to do is look at how, as things change in rural areas, how those personas and segments might change as well. So are there new personas that are coming forward? Are there new types of people moving into rural areas, or people who are changing as their activities in rural areas change? So this segmentation of both people and place enables us to identify a whole range of challenges at a very detailed level across different types of people and different types of people and the places within rural areas, which started to enable us to really look at some of the potential interventions that we could identify and deliver. But the other important activity we did and developed further in our Cumbria work was to look at how things are changing in rural areas. So look at the rural drivers of change, whether those be environmental changes, so climate change resilience, through to water security or ecosystem breakdown, through to economic challenges, things like second homes, changing regulation, economic diversification and equal development, and then some of the social changes, so aging population, social inequality. And we've developed a repository of all of these drivers of change, so about 200 different drivers of change, and we've categorized them as signals, trends, and trajectories. So signals being those drivers that are just starting to appear over the horizon that we're starting to think we might need to take notice of and start to monitor. The trends are those things that are starting to get policy developed around them, starting to be an investment from a public or private sector. Those trajectories are on those drivers are on a much more fixed trajectory towards becoming business as usual. So in a future mobility space, we're less concerned with things that have become business as usual, but certainly as they start to transition through signals, trends, trajectories, that's where we're particularly interested. And those rural drivers of change really help us to think out what will the future of rural look like. So we use those drivers of change to form levers. So we categorize them together to form a number of levers, as you can see in this radar chart. And we use those levers to alter the rate of change of some of those key drivers. So increasing or decreasing the rate of change, using those levers in different combinations to form different scenarios. And essentially, those scenarios can either be identified for the whole of rural areas, or they could be identified differently for different types of rural place. And we've developed a whole range of different potential scenarios that could be applied to rural places, from the status quo, where the current rates of change continue, through to a negative scenario where rural areas continue to retreat, where their economies continue to decline and populations decrease, through to much more positive scenarios. So an energized rural scenario based on future renewable energy generation through a high-tech rural, where technology is the focus of future rural economies, through to a natural rural, where a focus in rural economies on environmental recovery and regeneration, local rural, a scenario where a much more greater focus on rural delivery of services and rural control of it, and then the most positive scenario of all, of a rural powerhouse, bringing together those positive scenarios together to form a much more positive outlook for rural areas. So all that work, the rural scenarios, the place and people segmentation, as well as detailed policy analysis, enables us to come up with a rural vision and a new approach to supporting rural communities, and that's termed livable rural communities. So providing countryside and coastal people and organisations with access to their daily needs, locally, affordably and reliably, strengthening rural places to make them socially connected, environmentally positive and economically thriving. That's the rural vision we developed along with our clients. We also developed a set of supporting objectives and actually a detailed commentary on what a rural vision might look like. And that rural vision in mobility terms is summarised in this livable rural communities framework. So focusing on much stronger digital connectivity, supporting more things to be done remotely within rural areas, reducing the need to travel where people want to, supporting rural economies to keep up or catch up with urban economies that have already much stronger digital connectivity. Focusing on more local service provision, so rebuilding the local service in rural areas, partly based around mobility hubs and access hubs, so hubs where people gain access to a wider range of services. As we'll come on to in a moment, working as networks of communities in rural areas to take advantage of the whole range of services and facilities that a range of rural communities working together have, so making them greater than the sum of the parts, so that aggregation piece. In terms of mobility and transport themselves, making decarbonised, active, publicly available and shared transport as the focus of rural mobility, but actually recognising that for the foreseeable future, car travel will still remain a major focus in rural mobility, but crucially, ensuring that those vehicles are more often shared and that they're electrified to reduce their impacts. Supporting the connectivity from rural areas into the larger next tier up settlements by improving strategic connections, strengthening larger rural settlements so they continue to play a key role in rural areas, increasing that reliability and resilience, but also in delivery, those cross-sectoral partnerships, both within the public sector, but also with the private sector and third sector, both in terms of delivery and in terms of funding. Our work has also looked at the development of rural mobility interventions to support the delivery of that framework and that vision. So we've done analysis based around the propensity of different interventions to support the different needs of those different types of people we've looked at. So we've come up with a range of bundles of interventions for different types of place based on both the needs of people that live there and the deliverability of that range of different potential interventions. So in terms of wider application of our thinking, so we think that while much of this work has been done within the UK, we think much of this is applicable to outside of the UK. So that both people and place-centric approach really does align itself with any location, to be honest, urban as well as rural, but thinking about the people who live there and the types of place and those challenges means that our approach is applicable to most locations. Those future rural scenarios, while the drivers have changed and some of those levers might be different in different countries, many of the challenges and changes we've looked at, the 200 or so that we've got in our repository of changes, are applicable at a global level. But again, some of those changes will be quite different and their applicability will be different for different places. But again, the approach works. Visions and frameworks need to be developed for anywhere that develops a strategy to deliver improved rural mobility. And applicable interventions, we started our work with a scouring the globe, really looking at how things are being delivered differently in other countries in terms of rural mobility and bringing that back to the UK to look at the potential interventions to deliver. So there's a lot of global best practice and ongoing practice around rural mobility that we've looked and identified for applicability in the UK, but clearly could be applied elsewhere. And then finally, moving on to some further thinking we've done as part of our wider work in rural areas, we developed our 30-minute rural communities approach. So nearly a couple of years ago now, we developed our 30-minute rural communities concept. So there is a white paper that is available for download along with the presentation slides. So really, it's a concept that everyone should have access to their key amenities and opportunities at whatever life stage within 30 minutes, ideally by sustainable modes of transport within 30 minutes of their doorstep. And that's got really three key attributes or key aspects to it. Improving the baseline of social and community infrastructure within rural communities, so enabling that local support, but actually that clustering piece. So local settlements or rural settlements working in clusters together as an ecosystem rather than as individual settlements. So making the most of the facilities and services each one has. Localizing the layer of social infrastructure through community and public and third sector partnerships. So facilitating communities to deliver more things themselves. But importantly, where things can't be provided locally in those networks of communities, ensuring that there's that improved physical and digital access to the next level of services, so that wider connectivity to local market towns and cities beyond. So putting into practice, really focusing on enhancing, aggregating and harnessing. So enhancing physical access through improved decarbonised transport connectivity, enhancing the digital alternatives to travel, and bringing services into rural areas, particularly through delivery of mobile services. Aggregating activity, so aggregating public transport, highway, digital and energy assets, providing place-based assets, that mobility hub piece and access hub piece, and providing new forms of public transport, so new forms of publicly available transport within rural areas. And that harnessing piece, so harnessing sometimes siloed transport and place-based budgets across the public and private sectors to support new revenue streams for rural areas. Harnessing the local skills that undoubtedly are there, the skills and experience and resources within rural communities, and harnessing the energy enthusiasm of people, business and landowners in rural areas to bring together and benefit rural communities as a whole. And that's really around empowering communities. So building existing operations and emerging solutions, using community places to better effect. So thinking about the facilities and functions that are available within rural communities and making better use of them. Crucially, putting people and communities at the heart of decision making. So bringing local decision making and delivery, engaging and encouraging local political and community leadership, and capitalising on a whole range of approaches for communities to deliver and own services. So in the UK, there's a whole range of legal approaches and community-based business approaches, and that could be used to deliver a whole range of services. But importantly, baking in revenue generation, so ensuring that the delivery models generate revenue and they are self-supporting. And that's what livable rural communities could look like. So a range of different communities of different scales, with a different range of resources and functions working together in networks to support rural communities more broadly. So ranging from small hamlets with few resources and functions up to villages, to market towns, and then larger towns, all working together, connected by public transport and active travel. So in summary, we get onto Q&A in a moment, but in summary, in terms of our rural mobility approach, we absolutely see that we need to highlight the benefits as well as the challenges of rural places, focus on the specifics of different rural places, so not seeing rural places as one continuous type of place, but segmenting rural places deeply to understand the different challenges and issues they have. Taking a people's perspective, so understanding the needs and challenges of different types of people and how they face those different challenges in rural areas. Applying rural solutions to those rural challenges, so not simply trying to apply urban solutions to rural, but coming up with the appropriate solutions for different types of rural place. For cross-sectoral thinking and delivery, so bringing together public, private and third sectors, but actually within those sectors as well, bringing the different capabilities together to ensure that we make the most of the opportunities that different budgets and different policies and different capabilities can bring. Harness the potential of rural communities to deliver for themselves. And a point I haven't really mentioned, but funding, as always, is key. So one of our latest piece of work has really been about making the case for rural mobility and increasing the level of funding available to rural places. So that's the end of my presentation. So now some time for questions and hopefully some answers from the audience as well.
Thank you, Peter, for a fantastic presentation. So just mentioning quickly the housekeeping items you can download in the handout box when you go to open up control panel presentation slides, along with the future mobility 30 minutes rural communities paper that Peter mentioned. So I will start with the first question. How do you identify and track the drivers of change?
Thanks, Sharon. Yes, so we've got a team of about 25 people in the Future Mobility team in the UK, and we spend a lot of time collating news, scientific research, policy, industry developments, conference outputs, and we log all those in our discussion channels, which then acts as a database of information. Then probably goes back about 4 years now, and we've now got a repository of about 200 different drivers of change that are added to regularly. And we use those as those drivers of change and feed into those levers and those scenarios. And it's not just a repository that's static, we clearly update those as regularly as we can. We say we've got 200 now. It's about 150 2 or 3 months ago, so continuously adding to it from what we're seeing out there in the future mobility space. But we also assess and prioritize each of those drivers. So we regularly develop top 10s or top 25s of those key drivers. So there are kind of key changes, so the economic and environmental and social changes, but also the key technology changes as well. So we use those as part of all our projects, or many of our projects, looking at key drivers specifically, but also looking at those scenarios as well.
Thank you. The next question is about the bundles of intervention. Can you explain more about how you develop these bundles of interventions?
Yeah, so as much of our work as I mentioned in my presentation, we take a people and place-based approach, and the bundles used a propensity-based approach where we looked at the needs of different types of people, so used those personas. So we use the Experian Mosaic consumer segmentation data. So for those of you who try to get mortgages or loans, companies like Experian and others will give you a credit rating, and they have a big databases of information and data sets that support that credit rating that you'll get. So they produce on a very continuous basis a segmentation approach called Experian Mosaic, and it's got 15 high level different types of household in the UK, although they also do that for quite a number of other European, North American and some other locations as well. And we use those data sets to look at the different types of needs that people have when they travel. So things like reliability, comfort, affordability. And we then look at sort of relative need across those different segments. We then look at a whole range of different modes or interventions and how well they support those needs. Combine those together, and that gives you a propensity for those modes to support those needs. We then look at how those people are distributed in particular areas, and that gives us a population level propensity of those modes or services to support or interventions to support the other populations in those types of areas. So we also look at deliverability. So clearly some interventions are less deliverable in rural areas than they are in urban areas. So we take that into account, for example. That enables then to come up with kind of the interventions or modes that have the highest propensity to support rural areas, and then that comes into those bundles. So we essentially develop a set of bundles for each type of rural place. So that can be applied either generally to, say, rural villages or rural towns, or we can use it as a starting point to look at specific locations. So broadly, these types of interventions support this type of place, but actually what are the very specific needs of a individual place, and what are the current provision of services and modes and infrastructure there. So it really supports the identification of future bundles at specific locations as well, not just broadly.
Fantastic, thank you. The next question goes like this. In your future rural scenarios, have you integrated the interdependencies or potential ones between different systems, such as transport, energy, water, communications, etc.?
Yeah, so in terms of developing some of the scenarios, so some of those interdependencies will be individual levers. So from our Cumbria work, then some of the levers included digital connectivity, or digital as a mode, as we call it, so doing things online essentially, included the delivery of new modes and new services in the transport field. It looked at the changing energy field, so the application of new sources of energy within rural areas. So moving the levers for each of those groups of changes enable us to look at the interdependencies between them. But essentially, we can look at those in more detail or less detail, depending on the level of kind of policy analysis. So our rural work, certainly for the Southwest, but to a large extent for Cumbria, was quite high level, kind of at a strategic level. But if we're looking, for example, at a much smaller level, at a individual rural area or rural town, we could look at much more detail into some of those, how those levers interact as well.
Thank you. So the next question is about funding, your last point at the summary. So there's a comment and a question. So the framework you suggested will require significant funding to deliver it. So the question is, why make such investment in rural areas when they have comparatively small populations?
Yeah, question we get asked quite a lot, and it's a good question. I think in a early stage of my presentation, I mentioned the statistics that I kind of roll out quite often. So in England, at least, it's about 17% of the population live in rural areas, which are equivalent. I think it's equivalent to everyone under the age of 15, or virtually everyone over statutory retirement age, which is 66, 67 now in the UK. So by not providing investment in rural areas, you're really putting a significant proportion of a population at disadvantage. But the other kind of response is focusing on some of those benefits that I talk a lot about. So not just focusing on the challenges, but the benefits that rural areas give to us as a wider community, wider economy across the country. So thinking about environmental net gain, thinking about new sources of energy generation, thinking about net zero. If we don't invest in our rural areas, then we're putting many of those things at risk. Rural areas don't just have poor investment in terms of rural mobility, financial investment, because there's less people, but it's actually the pro rata per capita investment in rural areas is less than they are in urban areas. So to make any kind of difference at all, we need to increase funding so it matches urban areas per capita. But actually, because of the increased operational costs of transport, because of the longer miles, because of the lower population, then actually, arguably, funding should even be higher per capita in urban and rural than urban areas. So there's a whole range of reasons why, and the latest piece of work we've done was to actually set out that case for rural investment on behalf of the 7 subnational transport bodies. So a document I think is being released by one of the STBs, but about to be released by all 7 shortly in time for that conference in the next week or so.
Thank you. Thanks for clarifying this point. I will go with the last question. Is it realistic to expect more people to walk and cycle in rural areas? Are the cars always going to be dominating rural areas?
Okay, again, another good question, and clearly in putting together that framework for rural mobility, that Liveable Rural Communities framework, we thought long and hard about the realism of some aspects in that framework. So I live in a rural location. I drive all the time. I've got 2 cars in my household. My wife and I travel to different stations to catch the train to work. So from our personal point of view, we use cars quite intensively, but there are opportunities to cycle and walk more. E-bikes, for example, provide greater opportunities to do more in terms of active travel. E-bikes can increase the distance that people can travel, or increase the speed that people travel by bike, flatten some of those hills that put people off cycling in rural areas, which could provide an opportunity for more people to travel actively to a certain extent. but there does need to be an increase in supporting infrastructure as well, whether that be route infrastructure, so new routes, or actually making better use of some of those routes. So in some places in the UK, there are quiet lanes, so where kind of quieter rural roads are designated for active travel, where traffic is calmed, where there are gateway infrastructure put in, where people feel safer to travel on. And there's reuse of things like old railway lines for active travel, and there's one just down the road from me for that purpose. My own village has got 20-mile limit throughout, with traffic calming, kind of embedding those positive behaviours that 20-mile limits should bring to bear. So there's a range of techniques that we could apply to our rural places, to both settlements and the kind of a network that joins them, which should encourage more people to walk and cycle. But as sort of that framework, we're completely open to the realism that for considerable period of time to come, many people will continue to drive. But we need to make better use of those vehicles, whether that be through sharing the vehicles we already have, reducing the need to own a car by enabling people to gain access to car clubs in rural areas, and clearly decarbonising those vehicles as well. So how do we best bring electrification and EV charging into rural areas as well? So yeah, we're mindful that it's much more of a challenge in rural areas to get people actively travelling, but it's part of a wider kind of framework for future mobility that rural mobility, that we need to ensure we take into account.
Thank you, Peter, for a fantastic presentation. Thank you for everyone for logging your questions. So please feel free to follow up with Peter via the contact details shown on the screen, and we hope to see you in our upcoming webinars. So thanks again, everyone. Thanks, Peter. I will wrap up the session now. Thanks.